Thank you. Thanks very much for having Suzanne and me present at this conference. You can read more about our research at our website, selfconsciousmind.com. So 40 years ago, in 1978, Suzanne and I were participating in an anthroposophical study group. At the time, we were reading At the Gates of Spiritual Science lecture series, and we are also reading Return from Tomorrow by George Ritchie, the story of his very deep, profound near-death experience, detailing his encounter with the being of light, whom he took to be the Christ, and who took him on an extensive tour of the spiritual world. Suzanne and I found these two books mutually confirming. NDEs affirmed Steiner's indications, and Steiner's account of the spiritual world confirmed the reality of Ritchie's experience. Many years later, in 2005, we began studying NDEs phenomenologically. Neither of us has had an NDE. We considered NDEs to be the archetypal phenomenon of the relationship of the mind to the physical body. Very early on, we developed the hypothesis that the mind is a separate entity and separates from the physical body during an NDE. NDEs are experiences of crossing the threshold to the spiritual world, and as such, they provide a rich source of reliable empirical data about consciousness and the nature of reality. In 2008, we published our first paper on our theory titled The Phenomenology of the Self-Conscious Mind. At the time, we received incisive comments from two very prominent NDE researchers. Dr. Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychologist, asked, how does the mind interact with the brain? And Dr. Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist and the most prolific NDE researcher, stated, you need to show how the mind and brain work together. Those comments became the basis for our research of the past 10 years. Now our presentation is divided into three parts over today, Friday, and Saturday. Today is about our mind-entity hypothesis. So, a near-death experience, NDE, is a profound psychological event that occurs generally when one is near death or in a state of extreme psychological or physical distress. There are striking elements in the NDE. For example, there is a profound sense of peace and freedom from pain. There's a feeling of separation from the body, generally floating above one's body. One may see events in the physical realm beyond normal physical sight that are later verified as accurate. One may encounter deceased relatives or spiritual or religious beings, including a being of light. One may have a review of the events of one's life. One may enter a beautiful heavenly realm or a warm, dark, velvety void, feeling it is one's true home. One either chooses to return to earthly life or is told to return to the body. Now there's an NDE scale developed by Bruce Grayson that measures the number of elements and the intensity of the elements to give a measure of the depth of the experience. There are 16 elements in the scale. I've named a number of them there. And each is assigned a value of 0, 1, or 2, depending upon the intensity of the element, whether it's present, it's there slightly, or it's there very definitely. And the scale thus ranges from 0 to 32. An NDE is defined as 7 or greater. The average score for an NDE is about 16. So from 7 to 32, the average is about 16. The term near death is actually a misnomer. NDEs occur under many different antecedent physical conditions. Physical, I should say, also and psychological conditions, including sleep, meditation, fainting, alcohol use, and other drug uses, and so on, as well as the typical ones that we hear about, cardiac arrest and coma. Regardless of the prior conditions, the experiences have the same elements and the same intensity or depth. The experiences under the different conditions are indistinguishable. If you heard an account, an NDE account, you couldn't tell, if there was no indication in the account itself, whether that was during a dream or cardiac arrest. This strongly suggests that there is a common proximate cause for all NDEs, regardless of the person's physiological or psychological condition. For us, that suggests the proximate cause is the separation of the mind from the physical body. Now, this diagram shows 3 states of being associated with NDEs. The first of all is ordinary consciousness, and then something happens and there is a near-death experience, and then after the return to the body there is the post-NDE state, which is they're back to normal, but really not normal because there are a number of after effects. The focus on the NDE itself, there is a sense of separation from the physical body, an out-of-body experience. And in this state, all cognitive faculties remain. There is self-conscious awareness, perception, thought, volition, memory, feelings, even when all brain functions have stopped. The NDEr has lucid thoughts and hyperreal perceptions. There are veridical perceptions, as I mentioned, and many of physical surroundings outside the normal physical sight. Many of these are verified, and many of the accounts here have been compiled in this book, The Self Does Not Die, which I have a couple of extra copies. Suzanne and I wrote the foreword to that book and helped edit it. NDErs have the ability to move easily through solid walls and move large distances instantly, or apparently instantly, and with veridical perceptions from the distant location. The NDEr's prior knowledge and memories are preserved, and new episodic memories of the NDE event itself are formed, which are vivid and unchanging over time, and when they are recalled, they are relived. When you see an NDEr recount their encounter with the being of light, they will sometimes, well, not sometimes, frequently, they will tear up when they're talking about it because they are reliving it. A number of recent studies have showed that NDE memories, the memories of the NDE, are felt as more real than memories from real events. And there are numerous after effects from NDE. Most prominently, the loss of fear of death. The NDE is felt to be the most significant event of their life. Their life is changed forever. More specifically, their after effects include, on the physical level, NDErs experience interference with watches and electronics of all kinds. They have something strange about their electrical surroundings. On the physiological level, there are numerous sensitivities to bright lights, to loud sounds, to crowds, to some medications and some foods. And NDErs avoid watching television and movies, especially if they contain violence, but they generally avoid watching television altogether and movies. On the emotional and mental level, there's an increase in altruism and a less material orientation, materialistic orientation. But changes in attitudes lead to about 75% divorce rate if you were married prior to your NDE. On the spiritual level, increased spirituality and a decrease in interest in religious practices. And finally, there is strong evidence of the objective reality of the separate mind entity in so-called apparitional NDEs. And there are 7 verified accounts cases that are documented in The Self Does Not Die.
Can you tell me what's an apparitional NDE?
Okay, I'll give you one. The NDEr appears out of body to another person to communicate something. And both parties confirm the encounter and the communication. And here's an example. Olga Gearhart underwent a heart transplant. Her entire family was at the hospital except her son-in-law, who didn't like hospitals and stayed at home. At 2:15 a.m., after her new heart had been transplanted, it stopped beating. And she was finally resuscitated 3 hours later. The son-in-law woke up at exactly 2:15 a.m. at home, and Olga was standing at his bedside. She seemed normal. He thought the operation had been postponed. He asked, "How are you?" And she replied, "I'll be all right. There's nothing for any of you to worry about. Give that message to my daughter," his wife, and he wrote down the message and the time of day and went back to sleep. When Olga regained consciousness later that day, she was resuscitated, and she asked everyone, "Well, did you get the message?" And what had happened is that she had left her body and seen the operation and tried to arouse people who were in the hospital, couldn't. She went to her son-in-law, and that's what happened. So, can NDEs be studied scientifically? Yes. NDEs have a consistent, well-defined characteristic elements and qualities that we have described just recently. And when taken individually, NDEs appear to be subjective, but when considered collectively, they become the consistent observation of a common objective reality. The elements and details of NDEs have occurred to over 330 million people worldwide. There's a study of the prevalence of NDEs. And therefore, from the prevalence of the different components, it's an empirical fact that over 80 million people have had a life review. Over 200 million people have heard the words to the effect, "It's not your time. You must go back. You have more to do on Earth." And it's an empirical fact that over 300 million people have lost their fear of death. And therefore, we assert that researchers are justified to take NDEr accounts as objectively real, providing valid data for scientific study. And for our study, the primary sources we have taken are the NDE accounts themselves. However, there are standards needed for accepting NDE data, which data to consider, who is a reliable source, how can the accounts be validated. Tibetan Buddhist philosophy speaks of the study of extremely hidden phenomena. These are phenomena that cannot be observed directly or inferred from direct observation. They cannot be studied directly, obviously observed directly, and they can't be inferred from direct observations. NDEs are in this class of extremely hidden phenomena. For Tibetan philosophy, the only method is to rely on first-person testimony of people who have experienced the phenomenon. The person must be reliable and credible. So our criteria for using NDE data as valid for scientific study include there must be multiple NDE accounts of the same specific phenomenon. For example, the NDEr being told it's not your time. If possible, are there additional witnesses to the phenomenon? For example, there are things called multiple concurrent NDEs where two or more people have an NDE at the same time and they see each other. Or the apparitional NDEs that I talked about, like Olga Gearhart. If possible, is there corroboration of veridical perceptions by a credible third party? And again, those cases are documented in the book. And the secondary sources come from what we consider to be initiates or seers, like Rudolf Steiner, obviously, Sri Aurobindo, Edgar Cayce, and these are individuals who have demonstrated apparent clairvoyance or other higher sense faculties that resulted in expansive or all-encompassing knowledge of inner and outer realities. And many of them, we believe, had an NDE early in life, certainly Rudolf Steiner and also Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce has been documented. Rudolf Steiner is just our speculation. Initiation itself is an NDE-like experience. And, of course, we're looking for indications that are consistent with NDE accounts. So here's our theory, our hypothesis. We propose that the mind entity is something separate from the physical body, having a number of implicit characteristics. First, the mind entity is the seat of consciousness of the person, the essence of the person. All mental functions and capacities are in the mind, and these include, as we mentioned, perception, thought, feeling, volition, memory formation and recall, semantic, and world knowledge. And there are two states of mind shown here. One is obviously united with the brain and body and separate. In the out-of-body state, the mind operates independently of the brain and body, and this is seen in the hyperreal perceptions, vivid, indelible memory formation, and the instant response to volition. The mind interacts directly with light and sound and physical matter, and these direct energetic interactions produce awareness in the NDEr. In the in-body state, the mind is united and coextensive with the brain and body. The mind operates as an autonomous entity within the body. So it's either independent or it's integrated. The mind interacts through neural activity in the brain, for example, through the sense organs, to produce awareness in the mind. In this state, the mind is dependent on brain activity. Consciousness in the body is diminished here from the hyperreal levels NDEs have. A crucial question for this theory is, how does a non-material mind interact with anything physical? And we want to make an important distinction. The mind entity is non-material, but not necessarily non-physical. This implies it has some physical attributes that manifest according to the mind's own lawfulness. So let's look at phenomena regarding interaction of the NDEr's non-material body with physical processes. First, there is sensory interactions with physical light and sound waves. NDErs also report bobbing against the ceiling, a solid surface like the ceiling, and the ability to touch and feel an object or sense the texture and temperature of surfaces of objects by touch. This is in the out-of-body state. In addition, there are many cases of NDErs passing easily through solid objects like walls. And when passing through solid objects, some NDErs report a sense of resistance or change of density. Resistance or change of density, or a swishing or wafting of the NDEr's body. So in one case, recently we heard, Laszlo felt a whirl in his left out-of-body shoulder. So he was out of body and somebody came running past him, and his physical body went through Laszlo's out-of-body body, and he felt that there was a kind of wafting. So those are with solid objects. And then finally there are interactions with another person's body during the NDE out-of-body state. So when a cardiac arrest patient passed her hand through Raymond Moody's arm, she felt it had a very rarefied gelatin consistency. with an electric current running through it. So this suggests an interaction of the non-material mind-body, if you could say that, to sense neural activity. And an NDEr playfully tickled another patient's nose until the latter sneezed, suggesting that the ability of the non-material mind to trigger neural activity. And there are 3 cases of merging with another person, 3 NDEr cases, to see and hear through that person's eyes and ears, or to hear the person's thoughts. For example, a 48-year-old man was despondent and attempted suicide by hanging, but immediately regretted it. During his NDE-OBE, he sought help from his wife. She could not hear his cries, so he went into her body and could see and hear through her eyes and ears, and he made contact with her. And when he did that, he heard her exclaim, "Oh my God!" And apparently she knew what was needed because she grabbed a knife and ran out to where her husband was hanging and cut him down. So that's merging. Each one of these phenomena implies a subtle interaction with physical forces, with light and the molecular structure of matter. The most interesting of these is that NDErs easily pass through solid objects and sometimes sense a slight resistance or a change of density. This implies that there is a subtle non-material interaction or drag with solid matter, something like passing one's hand through water. In turn, this implies a new subtle physical force, manifesting in material to transmaterial interactions, again with its own laws. This follows from Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. For every transmaterial action, there is a subtle physical reaction. The subtle physical force is probably involved in mind-to-brain interactions. Interactions by the NDEr with another person's body imply that direct interaction with neurons is plausible. So with the feeling the electrical tingling in Raymond Moody's arm. The brain mediates all cognitive faculties because the brain's normal electrical activations are required for consciousness. So if there is mind-to-brain interaction, at some level the mind must some way influence the neurons to fire, otherwise you would not be conscious. And at some level, the neural activations must influence the mind to produce subjective experience. And intimate pairing of neural activations and subjective experience appears to occur, which implies direct interaction. And I'll demonstrate that in a way in the next slide. We realize that our position about mind-brain interaction is contrary to Dr. Heusser's position, but we feel that NDE phenomena have provided new empirical evidence to suggest that there is a previously unrecognized physical force involved in mind-brain interactions and that direct interactions with neurons actually occur. And here is, given the stages and timescales involved in even simple acts of cognition, direct interaction between mind and brain is the most likely explanation. Now, these 2 brain image videos show neural activations involved in reading a single word. And they show how the different regions activate in time. So I'll just show you. This is a single word, and this occurs over 400 milliseconds, and this is in real time.
This is
sorry.
Dynamic MRI?
Yeah, it's MEG. See if I can get this right. All right. So that's one word, and I've repeated it several times. So that's a word. And then here it is in slower motion. And I'll skip ahead because it... All right, so it's starting here at... And there's... Now there are 3 stages. And the first stage of sensory input is not present because in this video because it's on the other side of this brain image. It's on the medial side. And so there are these cases. Just start it here and I'll just go through it. It reaches a maximum here and there appears to be a reduction in pause, and then it builds again to here and carries forward to the final stage. We believe the pauses in neural activations are significant because they are an actual reduction in neural activation, apparently caused by the mind's activity and engagement in the brain, with the brain. So, 2 more slides. How might the mind-brain interface work? NDEs demonstrate that all conceptual content and memories, conceptual content and memories reside in the mind, even in ordinary consciousness. So how does the conceptual content work with the brain and come to awareness? And this next diagram is a schematic view. In actuality, the mind is not separated from the brain, but is intimately connected with it. And very briefly, in ordinary consciousness, the mind interacts and works with the brain by inducing neural firing, and that allows mental content in the mind to come to awareness. The mind first impresses the content on a brain region, that's the red arrow, and the neural activation in that region acts as a mirror, which then brings that mental content to consciousness, that's the orange arrow. And tomorrow we'll talk about this in much more detail. I just want to get this one last point, and that is the interface between the mind and the brain. So there are 2 aspects. First, in order to have consciousness, neural activations must work energetically to induce detection and awareness in the mind. That's the mind-brain interface, that's the orange arrow. Secondly, in order to have mental content, the mind must work energetically with neurons to induce neural electrical activity. In other words, they have to trigger action potentials in the mind-to-brain interface, and that's the red arrow. Very briefly, we propose that there are 2 interfaces that occur in the apical dendrites of the pyramidal neurons in the gray matter of the surface. Basically, it's at the surface of the cortex. And so the mind can induce consciousness by neural activations which can be detected. And because there are these processes in the apical dendrites that have ion channels, they're called dendritic spines, that in those ion channels the mind may be able to alter the molecular configuration of the ion channels to induce or to trigger neural activation. And if that's the case, then the energy requirement for this process will be very small. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll talk again tomorrow.
Okay, and Martin, did you have a question?
Yeah, it seems to me that all these near-death experiences are very, very similar to what William James and other people have, described in literature as religious or spiritual experiences.
Yes.
They're just more intense.
Right. Yes, and if a person has the after effects and doesn't remember whatever happened, whatever triggered the after effects, we would infer, depending upon the after effects, that they have had an NDE and they just have not remembered it. And sometimes they do suppress them. This is the second part of our presentation. In the first part, we presented the mind-entity hypothesis, based on near-death experiences, that the mind is a separate non-material entity united with the physical brain and body. Now we're going to present how the non-material mind works with the brain to produce ordinary consciousness or awareness. To start off, we want to give you an experience of visual perception to develop an understanding of how the mind works with the brain. We have a short video with two different types of visual experiences, pairs of images and sentences, to read one word at a time. So here's how it will work. Each visual stimulus is preceded by a white plus sign for 1 second, and so you need to focus your attention. Then there will be a stimulus flashed very quickly for 50 milliseconds. It's very important to pay attention so you don't miss the image. And first we'll present several pairs of images, and then we'll present two simple sentences. Alright, so these are the images. So watch, plus, second pair, third pair. Now the two sentences. First sentence, second sentence. Okay. So starting with the two sentences, could you read the words?
Yes.
Did you notice anything unusual about the sentences? Okay, probably the first sentence. Now the pair of images, did you see each image? Okay, well, okay, sorry. Sometimes it may not show, it's very fast. Did you recognize, if you saw the image, do you recognize what it was? Like, the second image was intended to be a contrast to the first image, and maybe it was a little jarring compared to the first. For example, we had Albert Einstein and... You don't know who that was? Lady Gaga. We have younger people here too, you know. I had to look it up. Lady Gaga. So, it was a blonde.
Painted up, seductive looking.
So all of those images are reasonably easy to recognize, even for a very short exposure time. The images or words flash for a very short time and then fade out with a faint after image if you study them. Go over them over and over. At 50 millisecond exposure, the electric impulses from the retina to reach the first stage of processing in the brain happen after the image is gone. So even without any further exposure from the impulses from your retina, basically you come to full awareness of the image. The image is fully segmented and identified all at once. And it's presented in your awareness as fully recognized and understood. The brain and mind have gone through several steps before the image comes to awareness. There's a specific pattern of neural brain activity when one is presented with an image or a concept that is incongruous or out of context or jarring when compared to the previous context, as in the picture of Einstein followed by Lady Gaga, or at the end of the sentence, the peanut is in love. Now, we'd like to present a final visual image, allowing for an extended time to view it. And this picture is a simple image, but many people have a hard time initially seeing what it is. Has anybody here seen this image before? Okay, well, hold on. Don't say anything yet. For those who have not seen it before, can you tell what it is?
looks like a dog or a bear.
Okay. Initially, well, for many of you, it may still be a meaningless display of black and white shapes. It isn't really a dog or a bear, although there are those images kind of in there. It is much simpler than that. Initially, all perception starts with the unprocessed image, which is called the given. Initially, there's no organization, segmentation of the image, and no concept of conceptual content. To recognize the image, one needs to get the organizing concept of the image. So this figure is a figure of a man, and this is the head of the man right here. It's a bearded man, some might say a religious figure. Is that enough for you to get it? Okay, let's start. Here's one eye, here's the other eye, there's the nose, that is the mouth and the beard. Okay? All right, so that's... No? All right. Okay, well, we'll have to keep going. For people, generally when they get it, it comes all at once. You see it right away. You see it. Okay? And when that happens, you see the image all at once in its correct context and correct segmentation. You see what it is. And this is an experience of intuition. So I'll go one more time. This is the head, the hair, the body, okay, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, beard. No? Oh, well.
Can you fill it in more?
That's about all I can do, except to draw. Just watch where this green is going. It's going around here. That's the head.
The face is just a little bit angled to our left.
Yes, that's the face.
Yeah, it's illumined from the upper right.
Yes, the light is coming here. This is the face, the eyes, the beard. Okay? All right. We'll have to move on. Well, for some of you, this is a case of infinite delay of recognition. But for many people, it's a delayed recognition that shows that there are two steps in recognition, cognition. The first step is the percept, which you see here without any segmentation of the image, without any meaning. The second step is intuiting the concept. Now, when you were seeing the pictures, you didn't have any problem with that. You saw the axe, you saw the feather duster, you saw Einstein, you saw Lady Gaga. And you recognized, even if you didn't know it was Lady Gaga, you recognized that it was a woman. In most cases, the concept is apprehended almost immediately in the mind through intuition. And what you're missing here is the intuition of the concept. And this is deliberately done for those of you who haven't got it yet, so that it's hard, just so that you know. Where do the concepts come from, such that we can recognize an object, a face, a word, even after only 50 milliseconds of visual stimulus? Where are the concepts stored? This knowledge is generally characterized as semantic knowledge. You know the meanings of words. World knowledge. You know that the colors of the American flag are what? Red, white, and something. And you know, and you have experiential knowledge, mental pictures from your experience in life. You have episodic memories of your events in your life. So that's our knowledge, our conceptual store, and our memories. How can we so easily parse or segment images into recognized objects? In most cases, one's intuition appears to be instantaneous. How do we integrate words or images into the prior context What if we detect a semantic incongruity like the peanut is in love? You immediately say, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Based on the evidence from NDEs, we can say that the mind appears to be an autonomous energetic entity that interfaces with the brain. And the concepts and meaning, semantic knowledge, memory, and memory reside in the mind, and perceptions begin in the brain, we'll say here, whatever sensory area, and then you come to recognize what it is, and the content comes to awareness through intuition. Thoughts and feelings and urges, volitional processes begin in the mind, so they begin somewhere here, and they come to act in the brain through activate neural processes, so that your thought comes to awareness. So even your inner thoughts, your endogenous thoughts, come to awareness. Memories are formed and reside in the mind and not in the brain. The mind forms these episodic memories of life events through the hippocampus, and they are recalled again back through the hippocampus. Semantic knowledge is developed through experience and is recalled through intuition. So if the idea of the mind entity is real, there should be ample evidence of the presence of brain processes during ordinary waking consciousness. You don't need to have a near-death experience to experience that. So at this point we need to give some background on brain structure and dynamics very quickly. We need to be familiar with these two images of the brain. These are both left hemisphere. This is the lateral outside side and the areas that we're interested in. This is the inner or medial side of the right hemisphere, and we're mostly interested in the primary visual cortex. The two main methods of imaging for what is happening in the brain in real time are EEG and MEG. EEG, electroencephalography, measures electrical voltages at the scalp, and they're measured in plus or minus volts. The voltage fluctuations imply neural activity in different regions of the brain, which are associated with different cognitive functions. In an EEG plot, positive voltages are depicted as reds or yellows, and negative voltages as blues and light blues. And another form of imaging, magnetoencephalography, MEG, measures magnetic fluctuations at the scalp. And these are really activation levels of where in the brain there is neural activation. And this is in real time, so this would be just for maybe 100 milliseconds or less. And it shows the general region being activated in red and yellow colors, or they will have individual dots for each subject that they measured. So here's an EEG example. An incongruent word in a sentence evokes a strong minus voltage at the top of the scalp. And in this case, it's a kind of blue-green, but this is a negative voltage here. And peaking at 400 milliseconds, and it's called the N400. And these are three different cases. And in this graph, negative voltages are plotted up, which is counterintuitive, but those are negative voltages, and then positive voltages here. And time is on the x-axis. So at 115 milliseconds, the N1 minus voltage peak is associated with detecting the word percept, the form of the word. The target word in the sentence shown here is yellow, Y-E-L-L-O-W, as in Dutch trains are yellow. At 200 milliseconds, there's a positive P2 voltage, which is associated with detecting the meaning of the word, the meaning of the concept of yellow, a bright, warm color. And that at N400, at 400 milliseconds, the minus voltage peak there's a minus voltage peak associated with the awareness of how congruent or incongruent the word is in context. So yellow is congruent because Dutch trains are in fact yellow. And that's an example of world knowledge, which probably most of you don't have, but take my word for it, they are yellow. And if we say Dutch trains are white, that's incongruent. And if they're sour, that's really anomalous. And in those two cases, you have large N400s, and the sour is larger still. And now, if we say the peanut is in love, there is likewise a large N400, and some of you kind of smiled and laughed. But consider the following story. A woman saw a dancing peanut who had a big smile on his face. The peanut was singing about a girl he had just met, and judging from the song, the peanut was totally crazy about her. The peanut was in love. And by the sound of it, this was definitely mutual. In this context, when you say the peanut was in love, you get this kind of level. It's congruent. If you were in this story to say the peanut is salted, then you get this. So it's very clear that what you are seeing in the N400 is how well the word fits in context. So perception and comprehension appear to proceed in three distinct stages in time. First, there is the detection of the percept, there is the recognition of the meaning of the word, and there's the evaluation of the word in context, the current context. An MEG example, again, it's an experiment reading a word. In this case, it is a novel word that produces an N400. And again, there are three distinct stages, but now we can see what specific brain regions are involved and the activations at each region. So at 115 milliseconds, there's activation in the primary visual area associated with detecting the word percept, the form of the word. And in stage 2, there is, at 165 milliseconds, there's activation in the occipitotemporal area associated with detecting the meaning of the word, the concept. And these researchers noted that there is a definite pause between the end of stage 2 and the beginning of stage 3. And then at the beginning of stage 3, even before 400 milliseconds where it peaks, there is activation in the superior temporal area and somewhat posterior to that, associated with the awareness of the context of how novel the word is from prior experience. So here the perception and comprehension appear to proceed in three distinct regions of the brain. So the three distinct times and three distinct regions. Now, here's the question. How long does it take to become aware? In the process of coming to conscious awareness, there is a paradox that was discovered by Benjamin Libet through a number of experiments. And we kind of mentioned that earlier this morning. It takes time for neural activation to build up to conscious awareness. Libet found that to achieve awareness requires a stimulus of a minimum or liminal intensity. You have to have at least this much intensity of the stimulus, and then neural activity following the stimulus for a minimum time. Otherwise, the stimulus remains unconscious. But if the stimulus is at or above the liminal intensity, one becomes aware of it only after 300 to 500 milliseconds. So if you have just the bare minimum, it's usually going to take you 500 milliseconds to become aware of it. Libet called this the time-on principle. Either there is no awareness, or there is awareness only after 300 to 500 milliseconds. Now, Libet distinguished between two cases. One is detection, and the other is conscious awareness. So even if you have a subliminal stimulus, even without conscious awareness, the subliminal stimuli are detected and have an effect, and that in neuroscience is called priming. The subject is unaware of the stimulus, but is very likely to respond later, showing that there was an influence. So that's detection. Advertising, yes, right. So subliminal influence can also be plotted in the EEG, and basically it's just that the amplitude of the activations are below a certain level. So delay of awareness applies, so this is the issue, delay of awareness. The delay of awareness applies to all sensations as Libet found in his experiments, and also to endogenous thoughts and volition and planning and daydreaming and imagination. So not sensory, but your internal thinking and acting, making a decision to act. So in our view, the primary purpose of neural activations, and this is a key part of our theory, is that neural activation, the purpose of neural activation is to bring mental content to conscious awareness. So if you see a brain image or you see MEG plot or whatever, and there are activations, then something is coming to either detection or awareness. So how does the mind actually interact with the brain, bringing thoughts and perceptions to awareness? According to our theory, the invisible non-material mind entity here is intimately united with the brain. From NDEs, we know that all conceptual content and memories reside in the mind. From Libet, we know that the mind requires neural activation to become aware of its own mental content, the sensory perceptions and your own thoughts. So there has to be a pathway for the mind to impress the conceptual content, for the mind to impress the conceptual content or the memories by intuition or memory recall on the appropriate brain regions. Neural activation from these regions then bring the content to awareness. And it acts something like a mirror, is our conjecture. So this is a schematic view or exploded view of the interactions between the mind and brain during the 3 stages of perception. And this is just one stage. To demonstrate the activity of the mind, now it's shown here separately, and the pauses between the stages. In actuality, the mind is not separated from the brain, but we have to show it so you can see what's going on. It's intimately connected. At each stage, neural activity from the prior stage, some other part of the brain, induces detection in the mind. So here you have some part of the perception. Maybe it's the percept. And that's the top orange arrow. And then during the pause between stages, the mind adds conceptual content, the yellow arrow, and impresses the combined content of the percept and the concept, let's say, into the next brain region. And that's the red arrow. Now, that induces electrical activity, which then in that region. The neural activity then mirrors, so there's a little mirror here, that's just a schematic, that the content and induces awareness in the mind. That's the bottom orange arrow. So, that's the basic schema, and here's how it would work for those 3 stages that we talked about, putting this all together. So in stage 1, here, when visual stimulus activates a primary sensory neurons, the mind detects the percept, the raw, uninterpreted sensory content. For example, the letters WHITE. And during the pause between stages, here, the conceptual content of the percept, the meaning of white, comes to mind through intuition and is added to the percept, and the perception, the percept plus the concept, the meaning of white, is impressed on the subsequent neural structure, which, oddly enough, happens to be where one does language comprehension in the occipitotemplar area. And then moving on, in stage 2 here, the activation of the second brain region mirrors the new mental content of the mind, detects the perception, the meaning of white. So you had the percept here, now you've got the concept here. And during the pause between the two stages here, the integration of the perception here and the given context, which is Dutch trains, is developed in the mind through world knowledge, and the mental activity, the perception plus the added context, is impressed on the subsequent neural structures, which, by the way, is where the N400 appears. And white is an incongruous color for Dutch trains, inducing a large N400 activation. But we're not done yet, because in stage 3, the activation of the third region mirrors the new mental content, and during the final phase, and the mind comes to conscious awareness at this point of the incongruous word white within the current context. Dutch trains are not white, and peanuts usually do not fall in love, and therefore that's when you become aware of, as soon as you saw In Love, or as soon as you saw Lady Gaga, you said, wait a minute, there's something incongruent here. Notice that there is an interplay alternating between the bottom-up processes, the orange arrows, and the top-down processes, the yellow and red arrows. So here, so bottom-up, top-down, bottom-up, top-down, bottom-up. Another point is there's a different brain region specialized for different mental content. So this is the place where we detect conceptual language concepts. There's a different area for objects, there's a different area for faces, and a totally different area for mental working memory and so on. In the pause after stage 1, so this is stage 1, here's the pause, the mind detects which region is to be activated based on the recognized content. So we're conjecturing that the mind here knows that this is language and there is a language concept, and therefore this region is activated. The neural connections from the occipital regions must also probably play a part, not probably, they must play a part. But still, the mind is active here. The mind is active in detection and awareness throughout. But it's engaged, but it doesn't become aware here. And when you saw the picture flashed before you, and you recognized it. You had gone through all those steps. That's a picture of Einstein, and I know that that's Einstein. World knowledge. So the 3 stages of the brain are the neural activation for the raw percept, the neural activation for the concept, and the neural activation for the conceptual context. And then the 3 stages in the mind are to detect the raw percept, to detect the concept, and then to become aware of the meaning and context. So this model of the mind entity is applicable to all conscious experience. This is the way consciousness works. There are 2 distinct complementary brain networks that have been identified, shown in this map of the brain. 2 distinct complementary brain networks. This is 2 sides of the left hemisphere. This is the lateral side, this is the medial side of the left hemisphere, so it's a slightly different picture. But on the outside side, there are the yellow areas that are involved in, and both sides, the yellow areas that are involved in sensory and motor processes that involve minimal semantic content, the yellow areas. And then there's an internally directed conceptual system used in semantic tasks. These are the red areas. So this is your language comprehension, the language context. There's also a green area which is shared with perception. And here the anterior cingulate cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, which are involved with planning and daydreaming, etc. And the red areas are called the default network. They are the semantic network. So when one is lost in thought, daydreaming, solving a mental problem, rehearsing what to say to the boss, you are using the red areas, and you are actually shutting down your sensory areas, defocusing. You're focusing totally within yourself, and these are the red areas. But as far as our theory is concerned, the mind-entity model is engaged in both networks, effectively throughout the cortex. With external sensory motor processing, the mind brings the perceptions to consciousness across all sensory modalities and coordinates motor activities in some of these yellow areas. And with internal sources of information, the mind brings semantic knowledge, simulations, imaginations, plans, and so on, episodic memories, to consciousness in the red areas. Now, Rudolf Steiner acknowledged the necessity of a brain for embodied consciousness with a statement, "For this life, man needs the physical brain as an instrument of consciousness. Without it, man cannot be conscious." And at the same time, he identified that the mind needs to repress brain activity by saying, "The human organization recedes," that's the brain activity, "whenever the activity of thinking makes its appearance. It suspends its own activity, the neural activations, and it yields ground. And on the ground thus left empty, the thinking appears. The essence which is active in thinking has twofold function. First, the thinking represses the activity of the human organization and then steps into its place. And for the repression of the physical organization is a consequence of the activity of thinking, and more particularly that part of this activity which prepares the manifestation of thinking. For us, the manifestation of thinking is the subsequent neural activity that comes about after the impressing. Oops. So we propose that this process of repression happens in the pauses that occur between the stages of neural activation. If you remember, that's a 400 millisecond time window, and there are 3 stages in simple mental perception and language comprehension. So the mind is actively involved in every stage. The insertion of the combined perceptual and conceptual content is followed immediately by neural activation in the region. All right, so that's the end of this. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the transcendent, determining the nature of the transcendent realm.
And this time periods that you were talking about, the 115, the 165, and the 400.
Yep.
What is the pause in between? Is there could it be any length or?
No, those are typical for visual perception.
So once the 115 occurs, then the 165 enters, and then the 400.
Yes, when the electrical potential starts to go down, before there is the beginning of the next neural activations, that's when there's this repression. Now, for simple things, you get it right away, but for the bearded man, Jesus figure, you don't get it. Okay, and it can take a long time. You can study that for minutes to hours, I guess, and the concept doesn't come to you, but it's there. And so that just tells you that there are 2 stages.
Robert, you mentioned electrical activity in the brain.
Yes.
There's also blood activity
Yes.
in the brain.
Yes.
Can you...
Yes, you need the blood for the ATP to drive the neural processes that produce the action potentials.
So functional MRI is seeing blood activity as opposed to energy
Yeah.
and...
MEG is seeing the magnetic pulses, and you need supercooled magnets, and you need to keep the head completely still, and there are some limitations I didn't go into, but you will find where there are activations. Sometimes some of the activations are missed because the orientation of currents, the dendritic currents. So it takes a while for the blood to catch up to where you're active, and so MRI does not really give you very precise timing.
But the reason for the question, and we'll talk more, is prosthetic limbs.
Oh, yes.
Based on blood signatures of the brain.
Right.
And then there's others that are based on electrical functions
Right.
of the brain.
Right. Yeah, sometime we need to talk about phantom limbs, because there's evidence in phantom limbs as well at some point. Yeah.
If I understood you right, then these images, they lasted for 50 milliseconds.
That's correct.
So, but it takes at least 150 milliseconds or more in order to get the percept plus the concept plus the congruence or incongruence.
Right.
So that means, in fact, that actually we get aware of that relatively long after
yes, quite long.
Stimulus was there.
Quite long.
Okay.
Yes, and that's Libet's delayed awareness. But you know that you've done some work, and current neuroscientific theory, you've produced neural representations that have then been interpreted by your language capability, and then it comes to your awareness. But we're saying it's the mind that's doing that.
So you're saying there are 3 stages for the neuroactivity and the mind, the alternation of oscillation, but there's only 2 stages in terms of what you experience. The given, and then the intuition and the recognition, the integration. Is that what you're saying?
No, there's 3. There's the percept.
Yep.
So it's like the picture of the man, whereas you don't quite see anything yet. And then you have the intuition of what it is, and those are 2 things.
Right.
And then there's a third thing of whether that makes sense in whatever context you were in. So that's the third stage. And actually, if you don't have that third stage, you still take that much time to become aware of it. This is the third part of our presentation. And we have presented the mind-entity hypothesis and shown how we believe the mind works with the brain to produce consciousness. And this is all based on near-death experiences. This is our most recent hypothesis dealing with the nature of the transcendent or spiritual realm. So, our hypothesis is that reality consists of the physical realm plus a more fundamental transcendent realm. And for anthroposophists, of course, that's the spiritual world. The physical realm is coextensive with and dependent on the transcendent realm. And our hypothesis is based on the fact that NDErs report hyperreal experience in 2 realms, the physical realm and the supersensible transmaterial realm. And the term transcendent here we're using implies surpassing usual limits. NDErs describe perceptions beyond the range of the usual perception, which is we call supersensible. They also describe that they are free from the constraints of the material world. There's no pain, there's a sense of separation from the body, and the ability to pass through solid walls. In both realms, NDErs report obtaining veridical information that would be impossible through ordinary physical means. In both realms, NDErs report encounters with deceased persons, usually deceased relatives and friends, and other spiritual beings. And in the transcendent realm, NDErs report experiencing unconditional love and interconnectedness. And they feel that it is one's true home. I'm home now, and I don't want to go back. Usually that's the sentiment. They experience memories of life events and visions of the future that are later verified. They say that they have access to limitless knowledge and wisdom and a sense of life purpose and meaning in life. Now, our methodology for working with this is to compare the elements of physical reality and examine the corresponding elements as described by NDErs of the transcendent realm. So, the fundamental elements of physical reality are generally held to be space, the three dimensions of physical space, time, which is considered the fourth dimension, and matter, or fundamental physical forces, gravity, electromagnetic force, nuclear forces. So, to develop our transcendent realm hypothesis, we are going to look at those three elements. Regarding space, we will examine the quality of the NDEr out-of-body perceptions in the physical realm. Regarding time, we will examine the phenomena of the NDE life review and the life preview. And regarding matter, we've already discussed that earlier in part 1 when we talked about the NDEr's experience with matter. Passing through walls, feeling a change of resistance, a change of density, being able to sense surfaces, and more can be said about that, but there's not enough time. So regarding space, most NDErs report that their senses were more alert in their NDE and that their perceptions were hyper-real, more real than real. And we have heard this countless times. This reality is a dream, is the dream. The other reality and what they were experiencing when they were out of their body is the reality. That's the reality. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, several NDE researchers further noted unusual qualities of the perceptions of the physical realm. They used a number of different terms: transcendental awareness, mindsight, omnidirectional awareness, global perception, 360-degree spherical perception, perception by transparency, hyperdimensional perception. Now, of these investigators, Dr. Jean-Pierre Jourdain from France, he is the president, or since he's being the president of IANS, but the International Association for Near-Death Studies, but for a long time he was the president of IANS in France. And he has participated in NDE research with the University of Liège, for example. He stands out for his detailed interviews with NDErs about the quality of their perceptions, and also for his incisive analysis of the phenomenon of NDEr perception. He was the first to assert that the phenomenon implies that there is an extra dimension to reality. So, here are a couple of examples, and I'm going to read them so you can read them with me, follow along. NDErs describe veridical perceptions of the physical realm while out of body, but with generally greatly enhanced perceptual features or abilities. So here's two examples. I could see at an angle of 360 degrees. I could see in front and behind. I could see underneath, from far. I could see up close, and also transparently. I remember seeing a stick of lipstick in one of the nurse's pockets. I could see, all at once, a green plaque with white letters saying, "Manufacturer of Arms of Saint-Étienne," which is a city in France. The plaque was under the edge of the operating table, covered up by a sheet I was lying on. I could see with multiple axes of vision from many places at once. I wanted to go through the wall. I don't know why. I realized it was not resisting me, and I went through it. I saw what was on the other side, a huge garden and a bicycle garage. And all of these perceptions were later verified. A second example, different investigator. I could see everything, and I do mean everything. 360-degree spherical vision. And not just spherical, detailed. I could see every single hair and the follicle out of which it grew on the head of the nurse standing beside the stretcher. At the time, I knew exactly how many hairs there were to look at. So the specific perceptual features described include global perception, 360 spherical-like perception, perception from everywhere. Here's another example. Although my eyes were closed, I could suddenly see everything, the whole room and myself in it, and I couldn't tell where I was seeing from. I seemed to be seeing everything from everywhere. There seemed to be no observer separate from what was seen. There was simply awareness. And perception by transparency, an example. When I woke up, I was above my body. I was aware of all the people who had been called into the room to help and what they were thinking. I think there was a cardiac arrest during an X-ray. I also found myself able to see my mother on the other side of the wall in the waiting room. At that time, I could also see other people in other nearby rooms, all separated from the X-ray area by lead-lined walls. I still could tell that the walls were there, but I could see the other people in the other rooms, and these perceptions were later verified. And then there is something called zoom and instantaneous displacement. What must also be understood is that it works like a zoom and a displacement all at once. When we take an interest in something, it's as if we zoomed in. It is the displacement and perception occurring simultaneously which allows this to happen. So one is here and one is interested over there. You zoom right in on it, and you move when you do that. So the question is, that's the phenomenon. How are we to understand what the NDEr's process of perception really is? Okay, Jean-Pierre Jourdain proposed that the process of NDEr perception could be understood by considering a thought experiment about the two-dimensional realm of Flatland. In Flatland, two-dimensional beings live in a flat world of just length and width, no height. The beings are completely flat like a sheet of paper. They're just completely flat beings. Everything is visible to them only on the edge. The edge. Only this part. Okay? This happens to be a chair. If you're a Flatland, that's the chair. That's the wall. Objects have no height. The beings of this world know that there are only two directions. Forward and back, left and right. There's no above and below. They don't know anything about that. Now Tweety is sitting in his bed, and he sees the opening of the door to his bedroom. So from here he sees the opening of the door. He also sees the chair on edge in the corner. And he moves through the door into the hallway and into the living room, and then he can see that his stepmother which has a different shape. You can see edge on that's his stepmother in the kitchen. He admires the edge painting here on the wall. There's the edge painting. You see how beautiful it is? And with the shading, you can make it look two-dimensional instead of just a line. So that's the edge painting that he can see. But Tweedy can't see the painting in the vault. Because all he can see is the wall. But inside the vault, there's another painting. He also can't see the ID card behind the sofa. Tweedy can't pass through the walls of the house because, as a solid being, he can't pass through walls, just like we can't pass through solid objects. Now suppose Tweedy suddenly has an NDE. He rises above his body, projecting him into the third dimension above the two-dimensional plane. He now hovers over the scene. Now Tweedy perceives everything in his world all at once, just as we can do that because we're three-dimensional beings looking down on it. He can now see through the sofa to see the ID card. He can see through the wall and see the painting in the vault. This is perception by transparency. Because he can see the whole scene, it's global perception. And he can move through the walls just by hovering above them in the third dimension. So with an NDE in Flatland, Tweedy is propelled from 2 dimensions to a higher dimension with expanded perceptual abilities. Instead of seeing things only edge-on, he can see the whole scene at once and each object from all directions at once. He can see inside objects, for example, his own body, which you couldn't see because you could only see the edges. He can zoom to any detail or move out to see the whole scene. Now, Tweedy's stepmother can't see Tweedy in his out-of-body condition in the above dimension. His NDEr body is transparent in the 2-dimensional realm. Now, Tweedy's experiences moving to a higher dimension during his NDE correspond well to an NDEr's experiences in their NDE in the physical realm. By extending the analogy of the 2-dimensional case going to 3 dimensions, we can postulate that there is an extra dimension to our physical reality. For ordinary physical reality with space and time, we speak of there being 4 dimensions. So in NDEr's expanded perceptual and movement abilities can be explained by the NDEr being in a higher 5th dimension. So let's consider the 5-dimensional analogs to Tweedy's 3-dimensional abilities. Tweedy, when he is above Flatland, has global perception of all of the 2-dimensional world. The NDEr has simultaneous omnidirectional awareness of all the physical surroundings. Tweedy sees inside 2-dimensional objects. The NDEr sees through 3-dimensional objects. Tweedy floats above walls, defying the physical laws governing Flatland, which a solid object can't push through another solid object, even though it's edge-on. And the NDEr moves through walls, defying a similar physical law. Tweedy can zoom in instantly from place to place in Flatland, and the NDEr can zoom instantly across physical distances by thought alone. So what are the implications of the 5th dimension? The postulated 5th dimension explains all of the characteristic NDEr reports of enhanced perception. The perceptual enhancements probably account for the common description that NDEr perceptions are hyper-real, more real than real. The postulated 5th dimension subsumes and infuses all of physical reality and includes all of the apparently unlimited transcendent non-material reality. So in Flatland, by being above it, you know that the above realm includes the Flatland. So when you are in this fifth dimension and you're in the physical realm, you know that there is another dimension, and actually you can go through a tunnel or some other transition to a higher level of reality or higher realm, the transcendent realm, and leave the physical realm. And that's what they do. And sometimes NDErs are projected into space, into physical space, into the universe. And they are shown aspects that you can now see from Hubble photographs. And, of course, our currently understood physical laws are not immutable, and we would say that there's a higher level to them, or there's a higher level of laws that also are effective in physical reality. So that concludes our treatment of space. Now we can look at the NDE phenomenon regarding the experience of time, starting with the life review. And about 1/4 of NDErs report having had a life review, a review of the events of their life. In the review, there is a simultaneous presentation of all of the events of one's life, generally in a 360-degree panorama or movie or tableau, and you are generally in the presence of a guiding spiritual being. And I said that about 80 million people have had a life review, given the percentages, that prevalence of the life review as an element of the near-death experience. 80 million people worldwide. During the Vietnam War, Daniel Brinkley blew up a hotel building, killing 50 innocent people. He was targeting one person. He had to blow up the hotel to get that one person, but 50 innocent people died. In his life review, he says, "I felt the stark horror that all those people felt as they realized their lives were being snuffed out. I experienced the pain their families felt when they discovered that they had lost loved ones in such a tragic way. In many cases, I even felt the loss their absence would make to future generations." Anita Moorjani says, "I saw my life intricately woven into everything I'd known so far. My experience was like a single thread woven through the huge and complexly colorful images of an infinite tapestry. All the other threads and colors represented my relationships, including every life I'd touched. Every single encounter was woven together to create the fabric that was the sum of my life up to this point." And if you recall, I believe Steiner has said that if you are walking down the street, a crowded street, every person that you're passing by has that relationship. And by carrying that forward to Anita Moorjani's experience, then every one of those people would be a thread that you have crossed and is in the fabric of the tapestry of your life. And finally, Göran Grip says, "Because of the love and understanding radiating from the being of light who was with him, I found the courage to see for myself what in my actions had caused him, the being of light, pain. And for most of the episodes, the being offered me an alternative way to act. Not what I should have done, but what I could have done. An open invitation that made me feel completely free to accept or not to accept his suggestions." Now here are some of the features of life review. Every episode of one's life is presented from the apparently most insignificant episode to the most memorable, focusing on one's interactions with others. The presentation displays the details of one's emotions and actions and the effects of those actions on others. In the NDEr's perspective, the NDEr is observing the event as if looking down on one's earlier self from an out-of-body position. Every event shown is hyperreal, with perception from everywhere, and zoom displacement perception. This is the same type of enhanced perception as the NDEr's out-of-body perception in the physical realm. The same unusual perceptual abilities occur in two separate NDE elements, and the fact that that happens further supports the idea that NDEs are objectively real events in both realms, because they are both involve the same kind of perceptual experience. From Tom Sawyer's NDE, he says, and he was at 8 at the time of this episode, I relived every exact thought and attitude, even the air temperature and things I couldn't have possibly measured when I was 8 years old. For example, in the life review, I could have counted the mosquitoes that were in the area. Everything was more accurate than could possibly be perceived in the reality of the original event. So what is being recorded is not what you perceived alone. That's there, but everything else. Additional features of the life review. Generally, the life review is conducted in the presence of a loving being who frequently is described as a being of light. And the being of light is frequently identified as Christ. Not always. There is no judgment except by oneself. There is no condemnation. The loving being feels disappointment and pain from our errors, our misdeeds. As with Daniel Brinkley, the NDEr may be shown the ripple effect of one's actions to others in widening circles through generations. This is another aspect of the enhanced perceptual abilities, because it encompasses one's relationships among other living beings. As with Anita Murjani, the NDEr may see their actions in relation to a vast, intricate tapestry, a fabric that is woven together of everyone's interactions. Every life that one has touched, and showing the interconnectedness with everything. And that's one of the things that NDErs say frequently. We are all connected. One is shown how one could have acted without condemnation or coercion, implying one has free will. The purpose of life is love, and that comes through loud and clear with the life review. The purpose of life is love, an activity that can be expressed only in relation to other living beings. Now, another phenomenon regarding the experience of time in an NDE is the life preview, a prevision of future events. The visions may be of one's personal future or of world events. Some examples. Ken Ring described a boy's life preview that included two predictions at the age of 10 in 1941. One, you'll be married at age 28. And the NDEr says, this did indeed happen, even though at my 28th birthday I had yet to meet the person I was to marry. You will have 2 children and live in the house that you see. This memory suddenly became present one day in 1968 at age 37, when I was sitting in the chair reading a book and happened to glance over at the children. I realized that this was the memory from 1941. If you think about how that could have been known in all of that detail, and there's more detail there, he didn't, to lead him to this particular person to be married and 2 children, and they're in the living room exactly the way it ended up being from his NDE. Pim Van Lommel described a life preview And the man says, and in a flash I saw the rest of my life. I could see a large part of my future life, taking care of my children, my wife's illness, everything that would happen to me. I wrote down all the things I saw back then, and over the years I've been able to check them all off. Even down to what shawl his wife would be wearing when she died. Alternatively, the visions may be of future world events, future technological events such as the development of nuclear power, and also natural disasters and political upheavals. Further characteristics of the life review include the memory of a future event is frequently suppressed after the NDE, and it may come back in a dream just prior to the event's occurrence, or is remembered only when the event occurs. And predictions that fail to materialize may be due to the free will choices of individuals that change the trajectory of events. And that's a way out that skeptics will claim that we're taking. But that's really the way it is. So what are the implications of the time-related NDE phenomena? First, the life review implies that there is an exact, detailed recording of all events in the physical realm, at least those involving human beings. All the actions, emotions, and thoughts of a person and their effects on other people seem to be inscribed in a permanent book of world memory that can be accessed by the change in consciousness during an NDE. The record appears to be built into the fabric of reality in the transcendent realm. Esoteric traditions like anthroposophy state that all the details of earthly life are encoded in what is variously called the Akashic Record, of course, we know that, and it's also called the Book of Life. And of course, there's a whole tradition about what happens after death, but clearly the Akashic Record is accessed during an NDE. The record appears to be an intricate network or tapestry of interrelationships for events as they unfold through time in the physical realm, with ever-widening ripples reaching to every other person. The life review implies that one has free will in one's actions. One is shown how one acted and how one could have acted. The life preview implies that future events are laid out and even rehearsed well in advance of actual earthly events. Thus, each person has an overall life plan. But out of free will, one can choose differently from what was originally planned, and the plan is adjusted based on one's choices. And then most NDErs are told some variation of the following. It's not your time, you must return. You have more to do with your life on earth. This statement is so common in NDEs that its implications cannot be easily dismissed. As I said, there are 200 million people in the world who have heard this when they had their NDE. It implies that there is a plan and purpose for one's life, things specifically to be learned, experienced, and done. It implies that one's purpose was set before birth and agreed to, and it implies that there are benevolent, guiding, transcendent beings present throughout one's life. And they are there to set you straight if you happen to have an NDE and decide that you want to stay. So the transcendent realm can be viewed as the ground of all existence. The existence of the Akashic Record implies the centrality of earthly human experience. The centrality of earthly human experience. Carl Sagan once derided our, quote, delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe, where our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark, a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. On the contrary, NDErs are told that we are co-creators with God. And you humans are truly the heroes, a being of light told Daniel Brinkley, because you are doing something that no other spiritual beings have the courage to do. You have gone to earth to co-create with God. So the overall implication is that there is a higher purpose of earthly life. First, we have the opportunity for our own individual development as free spiritual beings. Second, we can assist the evolution of humanity by developing our capacity for love, which will become a new force in nature. And ultimately, humanity will achieve the transformation of the earth as co-creators with God. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
So, you said that the NDErs experience, the out-of-body experiences, and initially feel there's no pain, they're free, but then there can be, in the life review, like
Daniel Brinkley, yes.
Is that, oh my God, I feel the pain
yes.
that I did to
well, yes, there's... Well, the being accompanying you may be feeling certainly disappointment, but also pain.
And also pain, right.
And you feel tremendous regret. There are some NDErs who feel so much regret that they say, I have to go back. Send me back. I can do better than this. So you feel this regret, but you also feel that you're back home. So I don't want to leave. So one can see how this progresses into actual death, going through the Kamaloka and going through the life review that is much more detailed. And NDErs, by the way, see in the transcendent realm, they see other beings, deceased human beings, who are studying. And what are they studying? Well, they're studying their life, their previous life. Yes?
I think it is astonishing how rich all these experiences are and to what extent they confirm Rudolf Steiner's teaching.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing is that this is evidence of people who have experienced this. And if, as you do, put this all together, actually there is a spiritual teaching which arises from that.
Yes.
And my question is, because of that evidence there is from people who come back and report about that, what is your experience as to the reception of this in the public? Because I could imagine that people who would refrain from anthroposophy because it's maybe far off and as spiritual science, but they would respond positively to such concrete experiences. So what is your opinion? Because this also shows a little bit maybe what the mission of these kinds of experience could be for our civilization.
Yes, exactly. Anthroposophy and near-death experiencers are on the same mission, essentially, and that is to bring this message to humanity. What happens, the response is, there's a number of different responses. First of all, people who feel threatened from a materialistic point of view or from their particular religious point of view, then they will oppose this. They do oppose this. This can't possibly be right. It's all hallucinations, or it's the work of the devil. Lucifer is coming to you. It's not really Christ. Because they are threatened by this. And the skeptics are threatened because it obviously can't possibly be true. And there isn't a religion Although actually in history you will find near-death experiencers have formed religions, and it's been pretty terrible result. For example, tens of millions of people dying in China in the 1800s because of a person who had a near-death experience and felt that he was God and had a tremendous following. So there isn't a religion, and the International Association for Near-Death Studies does not promote or even support any proselytizing. But what happens is that it is taken in a non-religious way, and there are a number of books. The most important one and the most popular one is Ken Ring. He wrote a book called Lessons from the Light. And it's doing exactly what I've presented here and saying, and particularly the life review, and saying, these are the lessons. You don't have to die. You don't have to have a near-death experience to learn these lessons. You need to start practicing what the lesson is, and the lesson is love. Yep.
Religion with the lower R is what we see in different denominations and so on. But the true word is religare, means bringing together again.
Join again.
And I think that is what is higher order religion, if you will, because it's based on how do you say, worldwide experiences.
Yes.
After.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's an ultimate religion, if you will.
Yes.
Without denomination.
Yes, and let there be. Everyone has to come to it themselves. Yeah. Do you have a question?
You said you could see a lot of parallels between religious or mystical or spiritual experience and the near-death experience, and that people in the former spiritual experience category may have had NDE experiences and not really realized it. If you have, I was doing a lot of mathematics here, if you have 200 million, 300 million people experience this is a fairly large, well, so few percent.
4 to 5%, yes.
Right. And so, have you felt, has there been much work done, comparing spiritual experience with near-death experience, and how many more, if you have 3, 4, 5% of people having near-death experiences, how many people have had religious experiences?
Yeah.
We talked about how, you and I talked about how there are records on these things, but
yes.
How extensive?
Yes, well, there have been studies of the Christian mystics, for example, Teresa of Avila, and they have had spiritually transformative experiences, another term we use, and NDEs are a kind of spiritually transformative experience, and there's tremendous overlap in terms of the elements, but there are some differences, and there are lots of different spiritually transformative experiences, like Kundalini is one, and you will not find that in an NDE. You will find NDErs who subsequently had Kundalini experiences, but it isn't part of the NDE. So there are differences. But what really matters is what are the after effects? Because we can tell from a person who doesn't remember having an NDE, they were an infant, or it was wiped out of their mind and hasn't come back yet. And yet we can see, well, these are the after effects. There's a whole long list of them. And people will check them off. Yeah. Well, you have had a near-death experience, or a near-death-like experience.
Yeah, and also, I think this so-called religious experience could be due also for interpreting the experiences in terms of the vocabulary that they have acquired, say, by a given
Yes,
religion.
and that's a good point, because what we found in a longer version of this talk, we talk about how what you see, you enter a heavenly realm or some realm, and in that realm, you see things that are comfortable to you. Well, it seems to be that they are kind of arranged, and we think that that's because thoughts are things, and when you think in the spiritual world, you create something. And so you basically create your heaven or your hell, actually, too, because people do have hellish experiences, some small percentage. And so the being that you see might be Yama, the Lord of Death in Hinduism, because that's what is comfortable to you, although Yama may not be all that comfortable, but still that is what you feel is what should be. And the spiritual world complies. And there are other cases where it's very clear that what they are seeing is really what makes them most comfortable.
Just to follow up on that, my understanding is that when people have said, the spiritual experience is wonderful and transformative and so forth, but it's only about a few percent, 2 or 3% of people who said it was a hellish experience. Don't tell me Kundalini is wonderful. Right. Even if 95% of people say it is.
Yeah, and what is the cause of a hellish experience? It's a very sensitive topic, because somebody that has a hellish experience feels that they are unworthy, or they are sinners, or they are damned, or whatever. And that isn't the case. But because we know from the rest of the NDEs is that is not the case. There is complete, unconditional love. So there is always forgiveness there. But one may be projected into a level of the spiritual realm, and George Ritchie had this experience. He was taken on a tour. He didn't. And Christ showed him what the spiritual world was like, at least in a number of dimensions. And he was shown a hellish realm where people were locked in their own negative thoughts and lashing out at everybody else, but they couldn't do anything because they were discarnate. But there were angels above. And what is required, because you have free will, is that you have to choose to be saved, so to say. And it's very frequent that an NDE starts off negative, hellish, and one in particular, Howard Storm, and he started to pray to God. Something inside him said, "Pray to God. I don't believe in God." All right. God bless America. And the beings who were attacking him moved away and said, "Don't say that. God doesn't exist." So he said more. Jesus loves me. This I know. and then they left him alone. From his childhood, when he remembered that.
He couldn't even really pray in any type of way.
He didn't
call a prayer.
Right.
He just kind of had these little slogans. That's all it took. But he had a desire.
And finally, he was left alone, and then he said, "Jesus, save me." And actually, the being of light, Christ, did come down to him and healed him of what he had suffered from these other beings, who were beings just like him, actually discarnate human beings with just like him with the same kind of attitudes. He was not the nicest guy before he died. And then it took him on a spiritual tour as well.
Could that be the doppelganger?
Yes, except that these, there's a whole bunch of them.
Oh, I'm doomed.
So I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, so I think that's...
Thank you.
Thank you very much.